let me start. First of all, there's a fabulous account of the entire history of the controversy right in here, so I'll just be rehashing. It turns out a lot of the things are in this excellent document, and I won't go into as much depth, in fact, as this has, so I recommend you go into that. But I do want to say one thing, which is that the controversy doesn't begin on November 29th or November 30th, which is where it usually is the usual starting point given for it, but the whole thing begins on October 30th with the opening of the show, and that's where my story with it begins, with this excellent, excellent show. And that's really something that's been lost track of. If we could have my first slide, please, my only slide, in fact. Just a moment, this is a lovely watercolor by Charles Demuth of Sailors Dancing, and this gives a real sense of what the show, for me, was all about. I gave it a rave review, which doesn't happen very often with the National Portrait Gallery, which historically has not been the most exciting place in the world to look at art. So this was an amazing step forward for them. And the whole show, as far as I was concerned, was unbelievably poignant, especially in his early pieces. You know, it starts as early as Akins, Thomas Akins, and then moves on. And these early pieces really gave you a feeling of a whole community of Americans whose voice was deeply repressed by the society at large. And there was very little anger, not nearly enough anger in those early works, but a great deal of sadness. And that's what this show was really all about. The show was really a mild-mannered show, excessively mild-mannered, you could say. So that was the show that I was thinking was up at the Smithsonian until November 29th, where I start getting people asking me if I'm interested in writing about some cockamamie story that was running in what everyone was calling the Christian News Service. And if you Google the words, in quotation marks, Christian News Service, it takes you to the website of what is now called the Cybercast News Service. But they deny that they are a Christian news service. They just call themselves CNS. At any rate, the story was running. This crazy story, headlined Smithsonian Christmas Season Exhibit, features ant-covered Jesus, naked brothers kissing, genitalia, oh my God, and Ellen DeGeneres grabbing her breasts. The devil, and the weird thing is she's not even grabbing her breasts. She's wearing a very substantial halter top. So it's actually... I happen to be straight, and I was very disappointed in this image of Ellen DeGeneres. So I was busy ignoring this because I didn't think there was a story there of any kind whatsoever on the 29th of November. There are all sorts of crazy saying all sorts of crazy things all the time in America. And as a good journalist, you have to ignore 99.9% of them. But then, on Tuesday, November 30th, I was coming home from the Corcoran Museum, having spent the afternoon doing something art critics almost never do, which was actually looking at art for my own pleasure. And I get an email on my brand new BlackBerry, which I was cursing already even before I got the thing, telling me that the Smithsonian had pulled, this was about 3 o'clock or something, on Tuesday, November 30th, telling me that the Smithsonian had pulled a fire in my belly. And I got a fire in my belly to write a story very quickly for the next day's paper condemning this movement, which seemed to make absolutely no sense to me. And the story really came out in its full details after I had written. I mean, I only had 2 or 3 hours to write my piece, and it was hard to piece together exactly what had happened. But what really had happened is that the Christian News Service, the Cybercast News Service, had gotten in touch with various right-wing members of the House, including, of course, a man who likes to pronounce his name Boehner rather than Berner, Mr. Berner, the new House Speaker, who called the video hate speech, and launched this campaign. I think the story I have from pretty well-informed sources is, and I've heard this repeated elsewhere, so it sounds like it's true, is that he went, in fact, not even he, his aides went to Wayne Clough at the Smithsonian and said, you have a choice. You can pull this video instantly, or you will lose $100 million in Smithsonian funding as soon as we're in power in the House. And you can understand why Wayne Clough panicked, because his main job at the Smithsonian really is to raise funds, and the thought of losing 100 million of them, that wouldn't look very good in his CV. And he panicked, and he forced, I mean, at the time I condemned in my article, and I feel bad about this, I condemned poor Marty Sullivan for having taken down the piece, but it wasn't the director of the National Portrait Gallery's choice. It was the secretary of the Smithsonian who made the decision and enforced it on his staff. So that's my understanding of what happened behind those closed doors. And that's really the beginning and end of the story. I mean, all that happens is after a very few hours of pseudo-controversy. There's no controversy. A few hours after, a couple of members of the House attacked the piece, essentially in private to Wayne Clough, the thing came down, and of course that's when the firestorm started. So one of the obvious lessons of all this is that if he had stood firm, my guess is the whole thing would have evaporated because, as many people have said, there was not a single complaint to the Smithsonian Institution before November 29th. There was absolutely not a word of complaint because there wouldn't have been. I mean, one of the funny things that happened to me is they say they pulled a fire in my belly because of all the crucifixion imagery. And I'm racking my brain trying to think of what crucifixion imagery they could possibly mean. So I get on the phone to all the people I knew who'd seen the show, reviewed the show, thought about the show, and none of us could remember any crucifixion imagery. I mean, there were, I don't know, 100, 150 works of art in this show. And the Wojnarowicz was by far not the most prominent or probably not the best work in the show. And the ants on the crucifix, which anyways aren't sacrilegious, were only 11 seconds in this video. So even professional art critics couldn't remember having seen those 11 seconds of sacrilege in the video. And that's really the story. What happens now, I mean, the only thing that happens after that, well, the crucial things that happen is that AA asks his work to be pulled, and they refuse. One of the absolute touchstones in the entire exhibition. The exhibition really sort of closes with AA's fabulous, crucially important, and wildly poignant image of Jorge lying on his bed, of Felix. My mistake, of Felix lying on his bed just minutes after he died. A tremendously powerful work. Interestingly, Brent Bozell is the head of the Cybercast News Service, didn't object particularly to that piece, didn't object to I heard gasps in the audience when you see the lips being sewn shut. Yeah. That's clearly the powerful, painful image in the Wojnarowicz video, not the ants on the crucifix. They didn't object to any of that. In fact, they didn't even really object to the sacrilege in that scene. Because, of course, among other things, once the video was removed, they were just as happy to continue attacking the show. It was straightforward homophobia. They don't like gay people, and they don't want images of gay people around. And I'll close by saying that, for me, is in a sense the most interesting thing about this show, is that it seems to me the controversy around all this is really weirdly, tremendously weirdly, about art and art criticism and curating. It's not really about censorship in any normal sense. It boils down, the objections boil down to, this is terrible art, and we've decided it's terrible art, and terrible art shouldn't be in museums. Well, that's sort of, in a way, that's kind of neat for me to think that people care enough about art criticism that everyone wants my job, right? That all these people from the far right think that what they really want to do is do art criticism. But somehow, for me, that's very important as part of the reaction against these people, is to make clear that they don't get to decide what art matters. And it would be impractical, among other things, to have anyone in American society deciding that other than professional curators. And the only thing we can do is put ourselves into the hands of professionals and let them get on with their job. And then there are going to be things they do. I mean, I can't stand the Norman Rockwell show, which was showing, a floor away. And I got to have my say and attack it as strenuously, as viciously even as I've ever attacked any show. No one was preventing anyone from saying that the hide-seek show was terrible. Everyone was free to do that. Very few people did. Weirdly, almost no one attacked the show. There weren't right-wing art critics saying this is a terrible show. What they wanted was the show to be destroyed. And that, for me, is obviously the heart of this problem, that there's every reason to complain about a show if you don't like it. And there are going to be shows that everyone doesn't like. I can imagine a right-wing curator putting on a show I wouldn't like. And I would complain about it, but I wouldn't try to get it closed down. And that seems to me the central issue in all of this. And with that, I'll turn it over to A.